working and paying for contributions, and I've been told I can top up those contributions to make it up to the qualifying years because I want a basic state pension. But no one seems able to tell me how to do that.
Okay, I think there's probably a number of issues here. Chris?
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think how many years you've actually built up already, I think it's probably, if you stop work after 7 years to start a family, you've probably got more than 7 qualifying years because you probably would have been qualifying for credits to the state pension system as part of while you were bringing up a family and bringing up children.
That goes with your child benefit.
That goes with your child benefit, that's right.
Oh, right.
And even now, if it goes with entitlement to child benefit, you don't actually receive the child benefit.
Oh, that's interesting because I've applied 3 times for a forecast, and each time they've said I've got 30 qualifying years, and I can't really understand that because I've only worked 7 years.
Well, it could be from those credits.
It could well be from those credits because you qualify for children while you're caring for them until they get up to 12 years of age. If you have more than one, obviously that can go on for more than those 12 years.
How old are you now?
I'm 55.
Okay, so if you've got 30 years, Sally West can consider now make that up to 35 years to get the full new pension because you're going to get it to what, 60?
Yes, of course. And just to add to what Chris said, is the sort of children under 12 that you get credits for, but earlier on in sort of the previous years, the credit went up for longer. So it may be that, you know, it's because you had children clearly before the 12 year limit came in. So it's probably, you know, it could well be like the 30 years, right? You can build up to the full 5 years, I think.
Full 35.
Sorry, full 35 years. There's another 5 years. Do you know when your state pension age is? I suspect it will be 66.
It looks like
We're all looking at our tables now. So the sort of, I suppose, the bad news is you've got 11 years to wait, but the good news is that's clear the time when you could be building up those contributions. Either working, I don't know whether you're considering working or that's an option. There are other credits for all people are sort of unemployed and looking for work, certain situations where people are carers, or there is the option to pay voluntary national insurance. So there's a range of ways that you may be able to bring up that gap.
Priscilla, just on the point of paying voluntary national insurance contributions, which are generally a good deal to do so, I wouldn't rush into that because you've got a fair amount of time left to build up those 5 years. I don't know what your plans are for the rest of your working life, whether in fact you will go back to work and therefore will pay national insurance contributions, or alternatively will decide to pay voluntary national insurance contributions. So the government is actually introducing a concession here, which will enable you to go right through until about 2023, if necessary, to make good any voluntary contributions back to 2026 or 7 financial years. So I don't think we can sort of rush at this at the moment, just hang fire and then decide what we're going to do with the rest of the working life.
Yeah, so they've got to get a job or go self-employed and get some contributions, and then at the end, when it comes time for your pension, think about whether you've got any gaps, and there'll still be time to fill those in if you've got a pension.
And to start paying voluntary contributions now may mean that if and when you do go back to work, you're actually still paying national insurance contributions, and therefore you pay the voluntary contributions for nothing at all. So not to rush into that.
Well, thanks very much for your call, Priscilla. That was helpful. We've had an email, which I'm going to do from Alex. Will pension credit still exist in 2016 as a top-up? That, of course, is the means-tested top-up for people who have incomes below a certain level. Sally?
Pension credit will still exist. Sometimes I think people have said, oh, it's the end of the means test of the new pension. No, pension credit guarantee will exist. And there's 2 parts of pension credit. The guarantee tops people's income up to a set amount. The standard amount is currently 148, going up to just over £151 in April. That will carry on for people in the new system. But the other part of pension credit, which is called savings credit, and that's for people who've got a little bit of extra either pension or savings, that will not be available to people who reach state pension age in the new system. But for anybody who's already a pensioner or will be a pensioner before April 6, 2016, they'll still be in the old system of pension credit, so would be able to claim either part.
So if beautifully explained, if I may say so, but there is the point, isn't there, that certainly the present government is trying to phase that out by reducing the amount you get. So although it will be there, it may not be as much as it's been in the past.
Savings credit has been going down in value as the programme.
Yes, we've talked about it.
I think they've actually brought it from the other way, Paul. They're looking to have a pensions credit minimum income guarantee level, as it were, slightly below the minimum state pension level. So, in other words, if you do that for a new single tier state pension, you won't qualify for pensions credit. But we know that many people are not going to get perhaps the full rate, so there will still be that top of the available too.
Yes, so of course it will look at your whole income. So if you've got a private pension, it's not getting it. But if you've got a reduced pension just because of lack of contributions, and you're not living with anyone, you don't have to rely on their income, you might get it.
And just to add another point around pension credit, we talk about the standard amount, 148, as Malcolm says, the new state pension will be just over that. But there are also additions for people who are carers, people severely disabled living alone, which is again, and people don't understand the benefit system, so a message that we always put out is, if you're on a low income and you're not sure whether you'd like to do anything, get a check, because many people are missing out on the low income benefits.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. You might still get it even if you're getting the full new pension if there's some circumstances. Right, well thanks for that email, Alex. And we're now going to Polly, who's in Devon, for your question.
Yes, good afternoon, Paul. Thank you. I'm due to receive my state pension in November 2018, when I will reach 65. Under the current scheme, I have the full 30 years of national insurance qualifying years, but obviously understand from April next year I will require 35 to be entitled to a full state pension at that time. So in fact I get 2.5 years to basically contribute 5 years of qualifying years. I was widowed in 2003, and up until next year I had assumed I would be able to use some of my late husband's qualifying years, but I know that won't be the case. But will I also be able to be entitled to any of his graduated or state earnings related to pension contributions to top up my pension at that time?
You can only claim off your husband's national insurance contribution record, i.e. claim part of his pension, under the new system, if at any time in the 35 years prior to reaching your state pension age you were paid the so-called married woman stamp, the reduced rate of national insurance contribution level which some married women had a right to.
Yeah, I wasn't. I was actually working, so I was paying my own.
You were paying the full contribution?
Yeah, and I've topped it up to 30 qualifying years.
And that's
now.
the whole of the 35-year period right up to your state pension age?
Yes. Yeah.
So, hello, Polly. I mean, the other thing that I think is might be worth checking is if you've been working and making contributions, you've most certainly been earning enough to, certainly in recent years, to build up some entitlement on top of the basic state pension. So you might be entitled to some state second pension, or to some SERPs from before 2000 in your own right.
Yeah.
And the way that the calculation for the new pension works is, even if you've only got 30 years for a basic state pension, you will also get something for those years that you've got additional pension as well. So your base amount may well be much closer to the full single tier level than it might appear if you only had the 30 years of the basic state pension. So again, because it's so affected by individual circumstances, it's worth, if you can, trying to get hold of a statement to see what other entitlement other than the basic state pension you might have.
But I was led to understand that there was some recourse to my husband's contributions in terms of graduated and SERPs, not his qualifying years, but some of that would also help in topping up mine. I wasn't sure. I mean, I will get my own, but I also felt that was perhaps going to happen. But
there is some provision about inheriting additional pension. It just depends precisely on people's ages, and I think, as Chris said, I think the first thing you need to do is to get a pension statement. You haven't done that yet.
I have, yes.
Oh, you have?
As you say, it is a statement. In the old days when my husband died, obviously I had a forecast, and it was, I could top my own pension years up with his, and I could use this, and it was a lot clearer. Obviously there's still a year of doubt and what is actually going to happen. And I suppose in April 2016 we'll get much clearer forecasts.
Yes, and I think it's difficult because you know, understandably you're worried about and you want to know what you will get.
Yeah,
I think it
very
would be
short time in which to you know, make this happen, really.
Yes, but I think as we said earlier that in 2016 when you'll get your actual starting amount, at that time you will still be able to fill in the gaps of voluntary contributions. You won't need to rush to do it now because they recognise that people won't be able to make some of these decisions before they've got an actual statement. So there's no need to do anything in terms of making up gaps now. Once you know exactly what your starting amount is going to be in 2016, then you'll be able to see whether there's any gaps you can make up those differences.
Yes, so when Polly approaches November 2018, when she gets her pension, as she approaches that time, she'll be able to find out exactly what her pension is.
But in 2016, you should be able to find out what the starting amount is.
Right,
and then you'll
okay,
still have
yes,
a couple of years, but you'll also be able to make any backdated
That would be
contributions.
a useful basis. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question from Susan, please indulge you. Can you be very brief, Susan?
Yes. My question concerns what constitutes a contribution year. How many contributions do you actually have to pay for it to count as a year? I have 30 years, but I also have 2 part years at the beginning and end of my career. And I also want to know how time in full-time education is treated. Are credits given for that?
Okay, Malcolm,
Well, as regards what constitutes a qualifying year, it doesn't mean you have to pay national insurance contributions every week of that year. Every year there is a figure which you have to meet to get the necessary qualification for that year. So it does depend on the particular year. And if you have only paid for some of the period, you should get a statement from the DWP or the Inland Revenue at the end of the year telling you how much extra perhaps you need to put in to make that a qualifying year. So you should be given that information if you've paid something. As regards full-time education...
one second, really.
Starting credits for the sort of, I think it's 16 to 18 if you're not working, but not when you're at university.
No. Okay, so get a pension statement and that should tell you. And if you earn more than £111 a week now, you will get credits for contributions, though you don't actually pay them. I'm going to have to stop the masterclass on state pensions there because we're running out of time. Thanks to Sally West of Age UK, Malcolm McLean of Barnet Wadding, and Chris Curry of the Pensions Policy Institute. Thank all of you. More on our website, bbc.co.uk/moneybox. Louis Alexander's here next Wednesday afternoon. Subject, power of attorney.
Well, that was Paul Lewis. Moneybox Live was produced by Diane Richardson. The BBC has published a report today on the future of news. It says the corporation should increase both its local and global coverage and improve its digital services if it is to remain relevant. The corporation's Director of News, James Harding, will be on the media show later on this afternoon to discuss that report. The media show is in an hour's time at 4:30. Coming up next, though, Inside Health.
I'm Julie, housewife. It's been 4 years since my last drink. Well, not counting all the relapses.
Sue Johnston, John Hannah and Paul Kay star in a comedy drama about recovering alcoholics.
All right, I'm Dano, alcoholic and all that. 3 years since my last drink, and I got a job.
Hey.
No, hold on, then I lost the job. Well, that's cool, because I hate the boss.
Love in Recovery continues every Wednesday evening at 11:15, and you can hear all the episodes on the BBC Radio 4 website.
And so now with Inside Health, here's Dr. Mark Porter.
Hello. Coming up today, matters of the heart. Why more women than men now die from heart attacks in the UK. Gluten-free. It's all the rage.
In Australia now, 30% of the normal population is taking a gluten-free diet. That's mind-boggling, really.
But is there any science behind going gluten-free if you don't have celiac disease?
The perception of food intolerance is about 8 times that of the reality if you try to formally and very carefully establish it.
Catching up on your sleep at the weekend? Could it be bad for your health and your waistline? And Boilers on Prescription, we examine a novel approach to helping people with chest problems. But first, the story that's all over the news. Research linking commonly used medicines to dementia. An American study has shown that elderly people who take drugs with anticholinergic side effects for long periods, drugs like bladder pills and antihistamines, are more likely to develop the condition. How likely isn't clear. According to reports in the media, people taking anticholinergic medication are at least 50% more likely to develop dementia later in life. But that figure's not in the original paper. So Inside Health contacted one of the authors to clear up any confusion. Shelley Gray told us that even taking the highest doses for the longest periods was only associated with a roughly 10% increase in the probability of developing Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia earlier than someone who hadn't been on anticholinergics. That's a very different figure. And another point that wasn't made clear in the media was that many of the drugs studied are already falling out of favour with GPs. Dr. Margaret McCartney's in our Glasgow studio. Margaret, widely cited examples of anticholinergic drugs include old-fashioned antidepressants, old-fashioned antihistamines, and old-fashioned treatments for bladder incontinence issues. There's a recurring theme there.
Absolutely. Many of the drugs that were being analysed actually are not ones that are in our top prescribing brackets. But I think there is certainly some worrying conclusions about this and things we should take from it.
We GPs may not be prescribing as many of these drugs as we used to, perhaps, but they're widely available over the counter in different forms. I'm thinking nighttime versions of cold and flu remedies, night sedatives, antihistamines even.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, but it has to be said that most of the time when you buy things off the counter, it's just a short course you get, and what we're really concerned about here is longer term use, people using them for months and years at a time. But certainly, if you're on something over the counter and you do happen to be using it regularly, there might be a better alternative for you.
One of the things that may concern a lot of people here is the fact that people naturally assume that if you can buy something over the counter, it's safe and effective, but actually, a lot of these drugs have fallen out of favour with doctors.
Absolutely, it's a really interesting thing that I think we do tend to think of over-the-counter medicines, thing you can buy in supermarkets, as generally safer. So there are numerous, I think, drugs available to us now, not all of which are a very good idea to be taken in the long term. Although it has to be said that we're really worried about long-term use of drugs, and when you buy things over the counter, it tends to be quite small pack sizes that you tend to buy.
I must admit, I wasn't that surprised by this finding. We know that anticholinergic drugs have an effect on brain function. They target acetylcholine, an important neurotransmitter, whereas treatments that we use for dementia, for instance, would boost levels of that transmitter. Was it a surprise to you?
We've actually known about this for some time. As part of what are called polypharmacy reviews, which is in people who are taking a lot of different medications, one of the things we quite often do is look down the list of medications and work out which are the drugs that have got these anticholinergic side effects. And it's particularly when you're taking more than one of these drugs, or taking one that's got very strong side effects from an anticholinergic point of view, like for example haloperidol or quetiapine, that we do start to get a little bit concerned, especially in people who are already older. So it's a cumulative effect that we're really concerned about.
So Margaret, a patient of yours comes in tomorrow morning who's been alarmed by the findings of this research. What are you going to say to them?
Well, I think we have known most of what the study presents to us already, so I don't think it's particularly new. And most patients should be under an annual review of their medication already with their doctor when they get a chance to sit down, look at the list of medication they're on, and work out if it's still working for them or not. Any prescription is a balance of risk and harm. If you're taking something that you're not getting a great deal of benefit from it, but it is putting you at risk of anticholinergic harms, this might be the time to say, do I really need to be on this, and try and think about stopping it perhaps. If you're on something that you're getting a great deal of benefit out of, you might be willing to risk the side effects. But remember, it's cumulative side effects we're worried about. It's sometimes people taking not just one, but 2, 3, or even 4 drugs that have anticholinergic side effects, particularly frail elderly people. That's the group I'm most concerned about.
Thank you, Margaret. And there's a link to the US study on the Inside Health page of the Radio 4 website. On my way to the studio today, I stopped off for a coffee and was intrigued to see gluten-free brownies on the counter, and pretty nice they look too. There was a day, not that long ago, when gluten-free foods were confined to a dusty corner in health food shops, but they've exploded onto the market in recent years and are now available everywhere, from supermarkets to fast food outlets. But what's driving this burgeoning demand? Margaret?
Well, in my mind, there are 3 groups of people who are using and buying gluten-free products. The first group are people who have celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition that people are sensitive to gluten and shouldn't have in their diet. The second group are people who use gluten-free products either all the time or intermittently because they think it makes them feel better. Perhaps they have irritable bowel type symptoms, for example diarrhea or bloating or constipation, and who think they may feel a bit better when they use gluten-free products. And the third group of people are people who think gluten-free stuff is good because lots of celebrities have advertised it as so, and say that their skin is clearer or they feel better or more vibrant or energised if they go gluten-free.
And it really has gone mainstream, whatever the reason for you taking it. I mean, I remember when to find gluten-free products, you'd have to look sometimes in the pharmacy. And now it's mainstream. It's in coffee bars, aisles in supermarkets.
And this is great news if you have celiac disease. Why shouldn't people with celiac disease be properly included in society and be able to make nice choices about what foods they have? Perfect. But I think the concern is that these fakes of Optum products are being marketed to people who are not necessarily going to get a benefit from it.
You would hope that the majority of people with true gluten intolerant celiac disease be medically diagnosed. They know the importance of avoiding gluten. They can't even have a tiny bit of it. But the others, I mean, they're making up their own minds, aren't they? They're diagnosing themselves effectively.
And it's a really big issue because people often describe it as a food intolerance and a food sensitivity, which is not something that's pathological, so you can't find a blood test or do a bowel biopsy and find an abnormality, but it's people who describe clear symptoms that they definitely get after they have particular foodstuffs. But the problem is it can be really hard to work out what foods are causing what symptoms. And there's been really interesting trials done. There was a famous one done in 2011 where they did a proper double-blind trial and they examined people who didn't have celiac disease but did have symptoms that were related to gluten. And they thought at that point that actually excluding gluten made a big difference. But there was a very big placebo effect. So there was a lot of people who felt better when they thought they were avoiding gluten but actually weren't. And the same study was repeated there a few years later and actually found that they couldn't demonstrate that gluten led to symptoms in people who thought they were sensitive. So the jury, I think, is still out. Certainly people who have irritable bowel type symptoms will feel worse with gluten stuff, but whether that's due to the gluten or whether that's something else in the products that goes along with gluten but it's not actually gluten itself remains to be seen.
Because herein lies a problem in that if you're cutting gluten out of your diet completely or reducing the amount that you consume, gluten is in certain food, particularly carbohydrate type foods. And it might be cutting out those that's doing you the good.
Absolutely, and there's been research done on this stuff called FODMAPs, which are different types of carbohydrates. And certainly some trials have found that when people who think they are insensitive towards gluten don't cut out gluten but do cut out these other short-chain carbohydrates, they can often feel better. So I think there's lots of work still to be done. Certainly people do get real symptoms, but they might not always be caused by gluten.
So what you're saying, Margaret, is cutting gluten out of your diet might actually lead to a much healthier diet. If you think of the sort of foods that are rich in gluten, so bread, biscuits, cake, pizzas, are things that a lot of us eat too much of.
Yeah, so it may be that you feel better because you're just having a healthier, balanced diet without too much sugar and carbohydrates that you use, and you're cutting up your calorie count. And it may be that you're taking in more vegetables and fruit, for example.
That's my next point. I mean, you don't actually have to buy gluten-free products per se. You could buy things that are naturally gluten-free, like lots of fruit and vegetables.
Absolutely, but of course they don't come with sticky labels on them advertising the fact.
Margaret McCartney. Well, millions of people may be opting for gluten-free foods, but is their decision simply the result of a triumph of marketing versus science? Is there actually any benefit in pursuing a gluten-free diet if you don't have relevant celiac disease? Dr. Pamela Ewan is a consultant allergist at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, and Paul Ciclatera is Professor of Gastroenterology at King's College London.
Great debate about non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The critical thing about this, from my point of view as a gastroenterologist who focuses on food, is that in Australia now 30% of the normal population is taking a gluten-free diet. That's mind-boggling, really.
Pamela Ewan, from the consultant allergist point of view, do you believe this is a clinical entity?
Well, we have a diagnosis we call wheat intolerance.
So you would point the finger of blame at wheat rather than its constituent, gluten?
Yes, I would.
People who present with wheat intolerance, what sort of symptoms do they complain of?
Mainly gastrointestinal symptoms, so they get tummy bloating, altered bowel habit, tummy cramps, discomfort. I think there is such a thing as wheat intolerance, and patients can improve when they avoid wheat and have symptoms when they're reintroduced. And these are not patients with celiac disease or not patients with wheat allergy.
Paul, what does the science tell us about this? Have we done much research into this?
The research for this sort of area comes from Melbourne, And there are a significant number of publications from the Melbourne group now looking at people with gastrointestinal symptoms, of which vary from pain, bloating to variable bowel habit. And the diagnosis is invariably irritable bowel syndrome. I mean, people keep going on about non-celiac gluten sensitivity. From my point of view, it's a subdivision of irritable bowel syndrome.
Pamela, what's your take on the evidence or the existence of non-celiac gluten sensitivity?
I think it's extremely difficult to know because it's extremely difficult to first of all establish that diagnosis clearly. There's no easy test for it. So you're very reliant on people removing gluten from the diet and saying they're better and it being given again and having symptoms. There are some interesting studies where they take patients who think they have a food-induced symptom, the incidence of that is known, and then they remove the foods from the diet, reintroduce them and try and prove clearly under medical supervision if indeed the food is causing problems. And the perception of food intolerance is about 8 times that of the reality if you try to formally and very carefully establish it. So a lot of people think they have a problem when probably they don't.
But do you think this exists or not?
I think wheat intolerance exists, and I think the difficulty with this is that if it's on a background of a patient having something like irritable bowel syndrome where they've got variable bowel symptoms, it can be quite difficult to show that changing your diet has a very clear-cut effect.
The science may be great, but does it really matter? People feel better on a gluten-free diet and they follow it. Are there any implications that we should worry about?
One of the problems, if you take wheat out of the diet, wheat actually contains a significant percentage of the Western diet's fibre content. And if you take that out, you alter the whole balance of the machinery of your insides as to how it works. And the crucial thing, in my opinion, here is to work with an experienced, adequately trained dietitian.
Pamela, would it worry you if one of your patients was following a gluten-free diet when they didn't actually have a sensitivity?
Not if it was only that. What worries me much more is when people sequentially start taking different foods out of their diet and so they end up on a totally inadequate diet nutritionally. And that's another problem.
So the gluten sensitivity starts off as a thin end of the wedge. They end up excluding other foods.
Yes. But there's no health downside providing it is only gluten that's being avoided and providing the diet's nutritionally adequate. What is, of course, a big downside is the cost. These products are hugely expensive compared to the normal equivalent. If you buy a gluten-free loaf, it will be costing around £3, whereas an ordinary wheat loaf will be about £1 something.
And you don't actually have to pay any more to be gluten-free in a way, I suppose, if you're looking, I mean, some of the gluten-free products we have, like fruit and veg, we'd all like to see people eating more of that.
Well, this comes back also to this fibre business, and that a lot of the patients that I'm seeing have irritable bowel syndrome, and just simply increasing the fibre content of their diet improves their symptoms. If you are an indigenous member of South Africa and every morning you do an 18-inch poo and be very proud of it, because of the fibre content of your diet, where we're eating highly refined diets which include sugar, and therefore the fibre content is reduced, and many people have symptoms from that alone.
Professor Paul Ciclatera and Dr. Pamela Ewing. Please do get in touch if there's a health issue that you'd like us to cover. Email insidehealth@bbc.co.uk. Now, heart disease in women. A new research showing troponin blood test used to spot heart attacks works well for men, but misses a lot of women. As a result, a revised, more sensitive test will be used from now on. But why the difference between men and women in the first place? A heart attack's a heart attack, isn't it? Laura Core is consultant cardiologist at Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation Trust in London.
A heart attack is simply damage to the heart muscle, and you can pick up a huge heart attack in men or women on an ECG. That's the old-fashioned way we used to do it. The electrical trace, absolutely, the thing that zips up and down when you see it on a television screen. But when you're looking for early heart attacks, when it's right at the beginning so that you can try and get rid of it and protect people from it, it's much more difficult to pick up. And we're looking for chemicals released by a damaged heart. And we didn't realise that the amounts released by men and women are different. Using the old test, we would only pick it up that hit a certain level, so that's heart damage, in the men. So women who were turning up with chest pain, their ECG looked at them fine, because it was early. They did the blood test. It didn't look as though it was quite bad enough to signal a heart attack, and they were sent home.
So even if the women do the right thing and present properly with their symptoms, they get sent home?
Unfortunately, that looks as though that's been happening.
What happens to the women once they're diagnosed? Is their outcome the same?